Hello, I'm Barry Pavel, Senior Vice President and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the Scowcroft Center's New American Engagement Initiative Future Foreign Policy Series discussion. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners, particularly in the wake of General Brent Scowcroft's passing last August. We in the Scowcroft Center seek to honor his legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in close cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Today, we are honored to host Representative Ted Lieu of California, who joins us to speak about an issue that is perpetually at the heart of international strategy and security, and that is nuclear weapons, posture, and authorities. Representative Lieu has consistently worked to reform presidential powers to use nuclear weapons under certain scenarios, and is an important voice when it comes to questions of how U.S. national security policy might be changed to meet looming challenges. This makes him an apt speaker for our Future Foreign Policy series, which aims to foster discussions that touch on some of the key underlying assumptions that have guided longstanding U.S. national security strategy, provide a critical assessment of the policies that flow from these core assumptions, and as always with the Scowcroft Center and our NAEI, provide recommendations on an effective way forward. By embracing new perspectives and featuring diverse foreign policy leaders, the New American Engagement Initiative hopes to expand the U.S. foreign policy toolkit to meet both traditional and emerging challenges and enable greater and more robust U.S. engagement in the world. The first month of a new administration offers an important opportunity and to question the policies of the past and to chart a new course. Representative Lieu certainly has developed important new ideas for U.S. nuclear weapons policy, and we're eager to hear his thoughts for how Congress might assert its constitutional roles in helping to shape U.S. national security going forward. Joining Representative Lieu today to lead this discussion is Ms. Alexandra Toma, the Executive Director of the Peace and Security Funders Group. Ms. Toma has deep knowledge of nuclear weapons policy and U.S. national security, having been a director at the Plowshares Fund, founding the Fissile Materials Working Group, which was a coalition that she grew to 80 U.S. and international organizations working to combat nuclear terrorism, another underappreciated threat. We thank her for joining us today to share her expertise as she leads this important conversation. Thanks to you, viewers, as well, for joining us for this event. If you have questions you would like to ask Representative Lieu, please submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom or tweet them to @ACScowcroft. And with that, over to you, Alex. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry, and thanks everyone for joining us. But especially Congressman Lieu, thank you so much for speaking with us today about such an important issue. And moreover, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you for your public service. Having had the privilege of working with a member of Congress, I've seen firsthand the blood, sweat, and tears that go into the job. And I'm just really grateful that there are folks out there who want to do it and dedicate themselves to it like yourself. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us today and my friend Chris Preble for providing us this platform to really challenge assumptions and to bring in new voices into the foreign policy space. So let's get started. Congressman, when you introduced your original bill to restrict no first use, and I'll ask you to explain that in a second, no first use nuclear strikes back in 2016, you said, quote, "Our founding fathers would be rolling over in their graves if they knew the president would launch a massive, potentially civilization-ending military strike without authorization from Congress. The current nuclear launch process, which gives the decision to potentially end civilization as we know it to a single individual, is flatly unconstitutional." Just a few weeks ago, you reintroduced the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act. So I want to ask you, tell us about this bill and how does it solve for the nuclear launch challenge that you described in your statement?
Thank you, Alexandra, for your question. Let me first thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us and for putting on this terrific event, and also to Barry for your welcoming remarks and your leadership. And Alexandra, I also want to thank you and the Peace and Security Funders Group for all that you do. So in regards to your question, if you look at the Constitution and what the framers knew at the time. They essentially gave the greatest power that they knew to Congress, which was the power to declare war. And Senator Markey and I believe that there's no way that the framers would have allowed one person to be able to launch thousands of nuclear weapons that could kill hundreds of millions of people in less than an hour and not have called that war. And our legislation is very simple. It simply says that before the president can launch a nuclear first strike, the president has to first get the authorization of Congress. Otherwise, the president will be violating the Constitution in the war clause. So it's a, I think, very simple bill. I think it's constitutionally sound. When we introduced it, President Obama was president. It was never intended to be directed at Donald Trump, although his administration, I think people looked at this bill and looked at it with more urgency, but it's meant to apply to any president and any administration to bring the nuclear launch approval process back into line with what the framers would have intended.
Can you tell us a little bit about Congress's role specifically and how involving Congress in decisions about nuclear weapons, especially, a lot of folks watching at home are thinking, no, I don't know about Congress. The approval has gone down. There's a lot of dysfunction. How would involving Congress actually improve the decision making in this area?
That's a great question. So there's sort of two general scenarios. There's one where the president has to act quickly because, missiles are flying at us. Russia's launched nuclear weapons at us, or China, or some other country, and the president has got to respond. And in that case, this bill actually doesn't apply. This legislation only applies to a premeditated nuclear first strike. And we actually would want that situation to almost never, ever occur. In fact, as Ronald Reagan has said, basically he said a nuclear war can never be won and can never be fought. So our view is that no one wins a nuclear war. So you want to make it extremely hard for anyone to launch a nuclear first strike. A number of countries have actually gone to no first use policy. Obama thought about it in his last term in office. He never quite got there. Hopefully, we'll see if President Biden would look at going to a no first use policy as some other countries have done.
Can you tell us a little bit about what are the chances? You mentioned this Congress. I know you just reintroduced the legislation. What are the chances? What do you hope in this Congress and working with your colleagues in the Biden administration? What are the chances of this legislation getting passed?
So my view of politics is that everything seems impossible until it happens. So if I were to tell you, 10 years ago that, hey, in a decade, a bunch of folks will be legally smoking weed in multiple states, you probably think I was crazy. But that's in fact what's happening. So you never know when an issue breaks through and something changes. And so we just keep pushing this issue. Senator Markey and I hope to get bipartisan support. We in fact got bipartisan support the first time we introduced this legislation. And if you just look at it from the lens of the Constitution, it's just very clear to us that the current launch approval process is flat out unconstitutional.
You referenced Senator Markey quite a bit, and I know he is a close colleague of yours, especially around nuclear issues. You two are really two, if not the only two sort of heavy hitters on nuclear issues today in the Congress. And I know over the years, since I've been working on nuclear issues, we've lost a lot of expertise in Congress. I'm thinking, obviously, Sam Nunn, Dick Lugar, Ellen Tauscher in the House, and many more. So, so the two of you, do you have colleagues? Do you have other champions? And if not, how might we increase expertise and engagement of both members of Congress and also staff alike?
So one thing we have seen is Congress asserting more authority over war powers. And in the last few years, we did in fact pass war powers legislation off the House floor as well as the Senate floor. Unfortunately, it was vetoed by the former president, but you do see Congress, I think, being more assertive now than it ever has been in terms of war powers. I think there's also going to be a move to try to reform the AUMFs, perhaps get rid of some of the AUMFs. My personal view is that the 2002 should be taken away, and then that the 2001 should also sunset, and we should put in a new one. So you do, I think, see both the Senate and the House doing more to try to take back what I think Congress historically should have been doing, which is be much more involved in decisions involving war and peace.
Are there others that you have worked closely with on, you mentioned this is bipartisan legislation on both sides of the aisle to raise up nuclear security issues in this Congress?
I remember I had a lunch with Senator Rand Paul last term, and Rand Paul and I agree on virtually nothing, except on nuclear issues we do agree on, and also bail reform. So we did talk about working those two issues. So you try to find allies and supporters wherever you can, and that's something we're going to keep on doing.
I want to kind of go back a little bit and talk about nuclear terrorism specifically, if that's all right. I know in 2017, just before leaving office, then Vice President Biden said that, quote, and I'll quote him again, nuclear weapons and the proliferation of this deadly knowledge to more nations and the possibility of a terrorist obtaining nuclear materials remain among our most pressing security challenges. And after years of leading a successful nuclear security summit process, of which Barry mentioned, the fissile materials working group, the group I started several years ago, was a sort of shadow, civil society component. There was virtually nothing since the Obama days and folks talking about the threat of nuclear terrorism. So I'm wondering, what you make of this and what role might the Biden administration or Congress play today to further prevent and take steps to preventing nuclear terrorism?
So the agencies are very aware of this. One of the main missions of the Department of Homeland Security is to prevent terrorist attacks on US soil, including nuclear attacks. So even though members of Congress or senators may not be walking around talking about that issue, it is my view that our federal agencies are very aware of that issue and taking steps to try to reduce the risk of it happening. By the way, I thought it's interesting you had said that I mentioned Senator Markey quite a bit. It turns out that we both are passionate about issues that can destroy the world. So nuclear issues is one of them, climate change is another. And those are two passions of mine, and I do hope that we can make some movement on both of these issues this term. But in terms of nuclear terrorism, I am confident that our federal agencies are on top of this in terms of the resources they need and the planning they're doing to try to mitigate its chances of happening.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to ask you one more question, and perhaps, Evan, we can go to I don't want to take up too much of my moderator's privilege. I'll ask one more question, and then I have a couple more in my back pocket. But my question to you is, how do you talk about these issues to your folks at home? We talked about, your district earlier today, and Evan is from your former district constituent here. How do you talk with constituents at home? How do you connect these important national security issues, kind of, very wonky issues of nuclear weapons and security, foreign policy issues, to those in California's 33rd district?
Well, actually, first I talked to them about is that they're going to get stimulus checks and they're going to get unemployment benefits as well as nutrition assistance and renters assistance. So we're going to talk about the American Rescue Plan and how it's going to help our country. But I do try to engage them on foreign policy issues when I can. And you're right, when I have town halls, it's not really the first question they ask, nor really the first 10 questions they ask. So it is somewhat of a challenge to try to get this issue raised among folks across America. So one thing that did in fact happen after we introduced our legislation is we had a number of cities actually pass resolutions in support of the legislation. And so that's one way to try to raise awareness. Also through events like this, like what the Atlanta Council was doing. So part of the challenge, because Congress deals with 1,000 issues, is just trying to raise awareness to Americans that, hey, here's an issue that actually could kill you and your family in the whole world.
Yeah, and that's hard when, as you're talking about, people are, especially nowadays in the pandemic, are really, individually hurting in so many ways that they see day in, day out. And this is, when you talk about nuclear terrorism or nuclear war, they're like, yeah, yeah, I get it. Sort of, I've seen the movies and how it all ends in a blaze of fire, but I can't pay my rent. And, I just ran out of food and I don't know where I'm gonna pay, how I'm gonna pay the bills. So it's that sort of that leap that you're making as a member of Congress, sort of telling the story of the importance of nuclear weapons as not necessarily an immediate one, but something that more folks should care about.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, maybe I can ask you one more question. Evan tells me I have a couple more minutes. One thing that has been in the news lately that that is on the papers, on the front page papers. I don't know if the LA Times still does an actual like hard copy paper, or if they've all gone virtual. But let's say the LA Times, you're the paper,
It's
and
thinner now.
okay, it's thinner. That's good. It'll help with the climate change challenge that you just mentioned. One of the things that we are reading about on the front pages is Iran. And, there are a lot of hopes for President Biden coming in and sort of taking up where President Obama, had kind of left off, because we all kind of know what happened during the Trump days with vis-a-vis Iran. So I'm wondering, have you thought or talked with colleagues or the Biden administration about what you think the U.S. should do or could do to re-enter negotiations with Iran?
So both Democrats and Republicans actually have the same goal, which is to keep Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And so I think there may be some differences in how we achieve that goal. I am really looking to see how the administration sort of views the sunsets in the JCPOA. As all of you know, the JCPOA was pretty darn good for the first 5 years. But then it starts to change and sunsets start getting lifted. And so, for example, in 2023, the ban on ballistic missile technology going to Iran goes away. And from my view, that's pretty problematic because if all of a sudden Iran can have all sorts of ballistic missile technology and weaponry and so on, Iran then becomes not just an existential threat to Israel, it becomes an existential threat to the United States. And so the question is, well, what do you do with that? What do you do with a sunset like that? That's pretty important. That's going to lift, in 2023, which is not that far away from now. So those are challenging issues, and I look forward to see how the Biden administration comes up with its sort of plan on how to address sunsets.
Thank you, Congressman. Evan, I think we can perhaps bring in the audience now. I think I've monopolized enough of Congressman Lieu's time, and happy to bring in the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. And those were wonderful questions. And we've had some questions roll on here. So we'll start with a hypothetical. I know elected officials frequently don't like hypotheticals, but we'll start with one and see what you think. This is from Steve Shapiro. Can you imagine a circumstance, however unlikely, wherein an ally's capital is about to fall to, let's say, Russian rapid invasion in the Baltics, or in another area, South China Sea, though, with an invasion happening, and both are militarily feasible, even if politically unlikely, military feasible that they'll actually achieve their goals. If so, can you imagine the need for first use of nuclear weapons to prevent such a calamity? And if that's the case, what would your legislation do in such circumstances? Would it allow for the commander-in-chief to use nuclear weapons? Would there be an obligation for them to use it? Would it change the command structure at all?
So thank you for that question. I previously served active duty in the United States Air Force, and it's very clear we have an awesome military with incredible conventional weapons. One reason that former Secretary of Defense William Perry endorsed our legislation is he said that he actually could not envision a scenario where we couldn't accomplish the same thing through our conventional weapons. And so my view is I actually cannot imagine a scenario where you would need a nuclear first strike. I believe we could in fact do it with the conventional weapons that we have. Now, maybe there's such a scenario somewhere in the future, which is why our bill does in fact allow that to happen. If Congress does in fact approve a nuclear first strike, then yes, that could happen. But it is hard for me to imagine such a scenario that we couldn't simply accomplish the same objective through our awesome conventional weapons that our military currently has.
So another question that I think relates to that, given that we have such a powerful conventional force, how do you feel about the proposals to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in refurbishing or building new nuclear weapons? How do you see the future of nuclear weapons in US foreign policy? How should we approach the funding of these programs?
So before I answer that question, I just want to add one more thing to the first question, which is there also is a difference. I think the person talked about, let's say a capital of one of our allies was about to fall. There's a difference if you strike that capital with a lot of conventional weapons versus dropping a nuclear weapon. You could actually rebuild the capital after you drop a bunch of conventional weapons. If you drop a nuclear weapon on a city's capital, not only do you kill lots of civilians, but the nuclear fallout from that makes it nearly impossible for you to rebuild that capital anytime soon. And so nuclear weapons are very bad, not just because of the indiscriminate ability to kill civilians, but also for their very long time, you're gonna have to wait before you could go and rebuild in the area where you drop a nuclear weapon. I'm sorry, now what's the second question again?
The question was regarding proposals to modernize the US nuclear force and invest money in particularly the ground-based light.
So I do believe in deterrence. It's another reason why we have a military, is to deter bad actors. And I understand for deterrence to work, people also do in fact have to believe that your nuclear weapons do work. So I'm not conceptually opposed to modernizing our nuclear weapons. I just think we have way too many nuclear weapons. I don't think we need to have the amount we have now to achieve the deterrence that we need.
The Biden administration and Secretary Blinken have talked about the foreign policy for the middle class. And I wonder, how would you connect the issue of nuclear first strike authority with that policy? Do you see there being a connection related to spending, or is this a constitutional question that people would care about, or is this just kind of an issue that sits outside of that policy?
To me, first and foremost, it is still a constitutional issue. I think the current launch approval process is unconstitutional. Also, this is an issue that could severely affect our country and the character of our country and of our society for generations to come. I mean, a nuclear war would be catastrophic, and the chances of that are low, but if it were to happen, it would be, if there was a nuclear war, we wouldn't actually be talking about stimulus checks, right? I mean, it'd be so catastrophic. So that's how I try to pitch it to people, that yes, the possibility may not be high, but we need to make that possibility as low as we possibly can.
There's been a couple questions in the chat about how citizens can influence the nuclear posture review and how you can apply pressure, not just to Congress, but also to the president and the whole system. What would you say to people about how they can be involved in this and what you would like to see out of a nuclear posture review?
I think President Lincoln had it right when he said public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So I think people being more aware of this issue can certainly affect its trajectory. And think about the various tools you can use now. So for example, social media is largely free. If you write a post on nuclear weapons and it is interesting, maybe you'll affect someone in Florida or in Ohio or in California. You can look at writing letters to the editor. It does turn out that a lot of people do write letters to the editor. Also turns out many of those letters come from the same people. So if you start writing in, eventually you will be able to get your views published and start influencing hearts and minds. So there's a variety of ways to try to get your voice out, and then working through organizations um, like the Land Council and other organizations. So anything to raise awareness. One thing that did happen in the last 4 years is because there's so many crazy things coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It sort of dominate the news cycle. It was the only time I knew when we had breaking news that gets preempted by breaking news. We're going to have a lot less of that now. And so I think other issues can start percolating to the top, and we can get the American public more aware of issues such as nuclear weapons.
To ask a somewhat self-indulgent question related to the think tank community, but going off that last question, how do you think the think tank community in particular, but the policy community writ large, should change their approach to deal with these issues? Do you see there being the right ideas being put out there? Do you see enough advocacy around it? What would you like to see being the work coming out of think tanks to move this issue forward?
That's a great question. So I think think tanks play a hugely important role in providing data and expertise and sort of the logic and intellectual reasons for why we should take certain positions or make modifications to certain policies or have certain laws or changes to regulations and so on. Think tanks are not so good at reaching out to the broad American public, right? If you would just ask the broad American public, actually what a think tank is, I'm not even sure they would know what that is. And maybe think tanks should think about ways to try to broaden your appeal to sort of the ordinary American that may not be thinking about these issues, and try to get them interested. So I don't know, maybe have really fun and interesting one-pagers instead of 25-page documents. I don't know. It is interesting thought that you bring up. How do you sort of get more people in the American public aware of what think tanks do and the important work that you do?
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and that's certainly been a conversation we've been having internally in a way that we want to engage further. Pivoting now to some of the specific cases where nuclear policy may touch and the approach the US should take. How do you feel about the future of arms control agreements beyond just the JCPOA, but in regard to North Korea, or even trying to bring China into a arms agreement? Do you see there being potential for Congress and the president to push and work with these countries to achieve arms control, or is that not tenable in the current international atmosphere?
Well, so I'm pleased that the Biden administration did recently agree with Russia on arms control for nuclear weapons. I think at some point we may want to look at taking some limited unilateral steps and seeing if other countries follow. So for example, we could take 10 of our ICBMs and say, you know what, we're going to remove the warhead, and we're going to take that warhead and store it a mile away so that, we're not on a hair trigger launch with those particular ICBMs. And then we hope you, Russia, or you, China, do the same with 10 of your ICBMs. And if they do that, then we can go, you know what, now we're going to do 20 more of our ICBMs. So maybe there's a way we could start doing something like that. If they choose not to do it, then maybe a year later we go, okay, we're going to put these warheads back on ICBMs since you guys aren't following this. But I do think if we can't get sort of mutual agreements, if we start taking some unilateral steps, maybe we get them to follow. So that's a thought. A second, I do think the nuclear countries need to really work together, make sure we don't have proliferation of nuclear materials to terrorist groups or to other countries. And then third, I do think that there is a possibility that with advancements in laser technology, that we could look at potential having better measures against a country that didn't have a lot of nuclear weapons. So, for example, if you could get lasers to a point where they could shoot an ICBM down in launch phase or in boost phase, that could be pretty darn effective. We're certainly not there yet, but there has been huge leaps and bounds in laser technology in recent years. I recently had legislation passed through the NDAA that has the United States and Israel actually partner on laser technology. So I think we might want to look at that. It'll never stop Russia or China or countries with lots of nuclear weapons, but we could potentially make North Korea think twice that if they're going to launch, 3 missiles at us, that we could potentially stop that. The current process we have right now, or these kinetic anti-ICBM missiles, where if you launch 4 of them, hopefully 1 hits. It's not the best system, but it is still somewhat of a deterrent. It's something that, for example, North Korea does have to think about. So those are some things I would look into.
Great, thank you. I'm going to kick it actually back over to Alex, because this is very much her area of expertise, and I think she had a couple of questions following up on things that have been said.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, no, Congressman, I was just going to, when you mentioned, writing letters, I had flashbacks to 16 years ago when I worked for Congressman Stephen Lynch, your colleague from Massachusetts, and just reading all the constituent mail. And back then it was faxes and they all smelled funny because they were irradiated. And anyway, like just reading all that, and it really does make a difference. So I think, for folks at home, just your advice is really good. I would, if you don't mind, I would also just offer that, there are NGOs that you mentioned. There's Beyond the Bomb, there's Global Zero. There are a lot of sort of grassroots organizations. There's FCNL, the Quakers, who do a great job sort of bringing people's voices to you and your colleagues on the Hill. So there are plenty of NGOs to sort of plug into, in the 33rd District in California, or wherever folks are listening from. So there are opportunities. I guess I'm wondering for you, when you do talk about these issues, back home, what are sort of things that you hear coming from your constituents when people do take the time to tweet at you or send you a letter or something like that? Like, what are the things that do resonate with folks back in your district?
So one thing I do is sometimes I'll go to events and I'll simply ask the question, how many of you know how the nuclear launch process works? And most of the time, no one raises their hands. And then I explain it, which is essentially one person, the president, wakes up one day and at some point during the day just decides to launch nuclear weapons. And no one in the cabinet is or has to be involved. No one in Congress, no one in judiciary. It simply goes through the military chain of command and missiles launch. It is simply that easy. And most people are quite shocked that, in fact, how easy the process is for nuclear missiles to be launched. And once I explain that, then people get more interested as to, well, okay, how can we actually reform that system?
You talked a little bit about U.S. policy being, changes in policy. And I know, again, this is, back in the heyday of the Obama days, when nuclear was sort of the topic of the day. And I think rightfully so. And I think rightfully so, climate and the pandemic and a racial reckoning in this country are the topics of today. But I guess I'm wondering, sort of the nuclear posture review, it's a kind of a wonky thing. It says, like, what is it that we have nuclear weapons for? So how might we change, in your view? How might you influence as a member of Congress, or how might the public influence what we talk about, with the stories we tell about our weapons through the nuclear posture review, through different sort of policy documents?
So I would hope that the Biden administration would take the view that no one wins a nuclear war and that nuclear war should never be fought. And if that's your view, then you would, for example, stop investing in low yield nuclear weapons. You would not want to have weapons where the military thinks they could in fact use it. And that's why I was a co-author of the Hold the Line Act. I thought we shouldn't have low yield Trident missiles. I don't think we should make it so that military commanders think, yeah, we could actually use a nuclear weapon. And by the way, low yield is sort of a misnomer. It's basically, it'd be like 1/3 the power of Hiroshima, which is quite devastating. And again, it would completely make that area unlivable, unusable for many, many, many years. So hopefully the Biden administration would reverse what the former administration did with regards to their view of low-yield nuclear weapons.
Can you say a little bit more about that bill? Because it is something that I didn't ask you about, but since you mentioned it right now, can you tell us a little bit more about what that bill is and kind of what it seeks to do?
Yeah, I would basically say, no, you can't have a low-yield Trident missile, essentially.
And how has that been received by your colleagues, either in the administration or on the Hill?
Trump administration opposed it. Don't really know actually what the Biden administration thinks. They've been in, approximately 50 days. So I think we'll give them some chance to look through their entire national security apparatus and our force posture and make some decisions. But they do know that, at least in the House, we were very interested in not having low-yield nuclear weapons.
Wonderful. Evan, I'm seeing some other questions in the Q&A. Do you want to, I'll pass it back to you. It's a little bit more of a dynamic event here. I'll pass it back to you if you have any there.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Alex. You mentioned earlier on the AUMF and wanting to repeal the 2002 AUMF and sunset the 2001. What do you see as being the key elements of the 2001 AUMF, and what would you like to see the replacement being for how the US uses its force and these guidelines on how we use our force, especially in the Middle East?
Those are incredibly difficult questions, which is why it hasn't been done yet. Although I do think repealing the 2002 AUMF should not be that difficult. It really was designed for the Iraq War. And it's not something that the military really needs to do anything with. And so I do think we could probably do that. 2001 is much more difficult because it is the basis for a lot of what the military does around the world in terms of conflicts. And so we do have to look at, well, if we were to sunset it or eliminate it, what would the new one look like and what would it say? One proposition is, well, okay, we can basically eliminate it and say anything you currently have ongoing now, fine. But if you have a new use of force, then you're going to have to come to Congress. So that's one proposal. There is actually a variety of different proposals. Another one is simply let's eliminate it, and then we're going to put in 6 months for the administration to come up with another one. My own personal view is that this is one of those issues where it's really, really hard to get the language exactly right. But whatever it is we do, I think there needs to be a sunset in it. So you don't have a AUMF that has no timelines in it whatsoever.
So bookmarking our time here a little bit together, I actually want to return to the hypothetical that I started with, and I got a follow-up to that. Using nuclear weapons to help save an ally in extremis does not necessarily mean hitting the allies' capitals, and there's a wide range of Russian targets, if we're using that example, that could be legitimate military targets. It may be somewhat optimistic to say that the US can always, and allies can always win a war using conventional weapons, particularly in a hypothetical scenario where a military quickly invades another country or quickly takes territory. This is something that we saw like with the Crimea example. Do you have any thoughts about how the US should be prepared to respond, how we should communicate our position, particularly in the Russia example, to either draw red lines or set standards in that area?
So it is correct that yes, you could strike, not necessarily at the capital being attacked, but if Russia was doing, for example, you could strike Russia anywhere. It is also one reason the U.S. military spent inordinate amounts of money to have stealth bombers and to have stealth fighters and to, be able to penetrate Russian airspace and, you can drop a huge amount of conventional weapons through our bomber fleet. You can also launch, right, a whole bunch of conventional missiles through our submarines. There's so many ways that you can strike another country with a huge amount of conventional force that, again, it's not clear to me why you would need to drop a nuclear bomb. So it's, I don't know, you can call me unimaginative, but I just honestly cannot imagine a scenario where you would have to drop a nuclear bomb, that you couldn't do it with our conventional weapons.
Congressman, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions and for your thoughtful responses. Really appreciate you being here today. I want to hand it over to my colleague Ode for some just closing remarks.
Thank you, Evan. Representative Lieu, Ms. Toma, thank you so much for sharing your views on key issues surrounding the use of nuclear weapons, and in particular, the presidential sole authority to use them. And thanks to all of our viewers who participated and asked very interesting questions during the event. I'm Aude Darnal, one of NEA's associate directors, and it is my pleasure to offer some concluding remarks after this very rich event. As Representative Lieu has made clear, it is critical that the Congress reassert its constitutional war powers, in particular in relation with nuclear weapons. This is not only important for global stability, but also for American national security. Indeed, in light of rising tensions around the world and the race for greater hard power, the president's sole authority in launching nuclear weapons and the sidelining of the Congress on such important decisions raises questions with a wider meaning for American democracy and national security. Moreover, as the debate over the need to demilitarize American foreign policy continues from all sides, it is important to engage on topics related to nuclear weapons, such as the development of low-yield nuclear warheads, as you mentioned, from a wider lens, taking into account the risk of rapid escalation and the exacerbation of the security dilemma for the United States, its allies, and adversaries. Other underappreciated consequential issues, such as the long-term environmental and health consequences, which again you alluded to, should also be brought forward in the debate. On that note, I'd like to thank you again, Representative Lieu and Ms. Toma, and thanks all of our viewers for joining us. NEI continues its assumption testing work. We have published in February and March our first 3 papers from our assumption testing series, and we have also already launched 4 shorter pieces from our reality check series, all written by our senior fellows. We will host in April our 3rd Future Foreign Policy Series event, featuring other insightful voices. So keep an eye out on our website to remain updated on our work. Thanks again and have a pleasant day.